Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Hosea chapters 12 through 14, where we read of Israel's past, her present, and in the last chapter, her future. So far, we've looked at Hosea. We've been going through Hosea in our earlier series, and we saw Hosea's marriage, which became a picture of God's relationship with the nation. And in that light, we saw that he had taken as his wife Gomer, and she turned out to be an unfaithful wife. This was not just by chance, this was actually by design, because God was using her life, her unfaithfulness, to picture Israel's unfaithfulness. So we saw her unfaithfulness, how she was disciplined, and then ultimately there was a promise of restoration. Then we come to Hosea's message. The first section was chapters 4 through 11, and we saw the case of God's covenant lawsuit. That was set forth as it brought a legal testimony against Israel for being that unfaithful bride, and it's described in the case, almost in the situation of a court case, using the sorts of terminology that you would hear in court. Now, as we come to chapters 12 through 14, we're going to see a continuation of that same covenant lawsuit, but this time it's going to be interspersed with a number of references to Israel's past history of unfaithfulness, and also what she's doing in the present. And then when we come to chapter 14, there will be a promise of future restoration. Remember, our scene is we've got Israel, and Judah is going to be mentioned too, and Israel sits between two much greater empires: Egypt to the southwest, Assyria to the northeast. And as our passage opens, chapter 12 and verse 1, Ephraim, that's one of the tribes of Israel, Ephraim feeds on wind and pursues the east wind continually. Now, notice what's to the east, it's Assyria. And sometimes Ephraim finds herself trying to either make treaties or, in one way or the other, deal with the Assyrian problem. Notice he multiplies lies and violence. These were just different approaches to how to deal with the Assyrians. Moreover, he makes a covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. So notice he's making a covenant with one while he's trying to enter into negotiations with the other, as if to say he's trying to grease the tracks between these two greater nations on either side, between which he finds himself sandwiched. Verse 2, the Lord also has a dispute with Judah. And notice now we're going to go back in past history. A reference is made to Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. And now we go back to the early history, the original history of Jacob. After all, the word Jacob, the name Jacob, means the one who grabs the heel. And we see this in verse 3. In the womb, he took, that is, Jacob took his brother by the heel. When they were born, they came out of the womb. Little Jacob was holding on to his older brother by just a couple of minutes, was holding on to his heel. And they had an expression back then. In fact, we have one today. Today we say, he's pulling my leg, and that means he's trying to trick me. Usually it's a harmless prank. Back then, to grab somebody's heel was a figure of speech similarly, but it meant that he was trying to cheat him. And so in the womb, he took his brother by the heel, and in his maturity, he contended not with his brother, but with God. Notice Jacob, every time we see him, from the time he's born all the way up to the time you see him wrestling with God himself, you see him always struggling. Verse 4, yes, he wrestled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He found him at Bethel, and there he spoke with us, even the Lord, the God of hosts. The Lord is his name. And so you have the story of Jacob is all about him wrestling with God, sometimes in a good way. Lord, I want your blessing, and I think that was good, but sometimes in a not so good way. Verse 6, therefore, return to your God. Observe kindness. Now, that word kindness is our old friend chesed. It's sometimes translated loving kindness. Earlier, we've already seen it translated as loyalty, and I think that might fit here as well. Be loyal. Have loyalty and justice and wait for your God continually. It's not necessarily talking about kindness to other people, although that's a good thing too. But here it's speaking about what you do toward God, and you in light of God and what He demands, you show loyalty, you do justice, and you trust in Him. You wait for Him, not just for a minute, but continually. Now we jump forward to verse 12. We see another one of those events of past history. This time it's where Jacob fled to the land of Aram. Aram was what we call Syria today, not Assyria, that's a different country, but Syria, the place where Damascus is. And so Jacob fled to the land of Aram and Israel. Israel is another name for Jacob. He worked for a wife, and for a wife he kept sheep. Remember, that's the story of Jacob who wanted Rachel, but instead he didn't get Rachel, he got Leah. He eventually got them both. He married both sisters. Verse 13, but by a prophet the Lord brought Israel from Egypt, and by a prophet he was kept. Now, notice it jumps forward to how Israel, not how Israel went to Egypt, but how Israel came back from Egypt. And of course, the prophet that we're speaking of was the prophet Moses. Now we jump forward to chapter 13 and verse 1. When Ephraim spoke, there was trembling. He exalted himself in Israel. This is Ephraim is one of the tribes that did exercise a certain amount of leadership. After all, Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim and others, and so Ephraim was considered to be a leader among the tribes. Although that leadership could be used for good, sometimes it could also be used for bad. Notice, but through Baal he did wrong and died. Now, what does it mean that Ephraim died? This can be taken a couple of different ways. One of the things you ought to be aware of is that in the worship of the different Baal cults, and notice it says, but through Baal, it's actually, but through the Baal. Baal is a title, not just a name, although it can be used in both ways. But through the Baal, he did wrong and died. One of one of the aspects of worship of Baal was where Baal he was in charge of the weather and the seasons, the rains, and the idea was in certain times of the year the rains stop and everything sort of dies. But then at the end of that time, the pagan rituals thought that Baal would bring back the rains and bring back the fertility. And so notice going through Baal, here's Ephraim seeking to bring back life, but instead worshiping Baal was a wrong thing. And instead of having things die and then coming back, everything dies and stays dead. Verse 2, and now they sin more and more and make for themselves molten images. Notice how this is speaking of idolatry. He goes on, idols skillfully made from their silver, all of them the work of craftsmen. They say of them, let the men who sacrifice kiss the calves. What does it mean to kiss the calves? Well, to kiss towards something was to worship it. That's actually the language of worship in Hebrew. And what's more, the the Israelites had set up two golden calves after the fashion that Aaron had done back in the days of Moses. But once the kingdom was divided, they had set up a golden calf in Bethel and another one way up in Dan. And these became objects of worship and idolatry. And that was a bad thing as well. Verse 3, therefore, they will be like the morning cloud and like dew, which soon disappears. In other words, it's there when the sun first comes up, but then it's gone. The dew, which is there when the sun first arises, but then within a half an hour to an hour, it's dried up and it's gone. Like chaff, which is blown away from the threshing floor. Chaff is what you would do is when you were harvesting the grain, you would grind it up, and that's going to have the kernels of grain mixed in with the chaff, and then you throw it up all up in the air on the threshing floor, and the threshing floor has to be like high up where there's plenty of wind and plenty of ventilation, and then the wind catches the chaff and blows it away. That's what it's supposed to do. But notice, these rebellious people, these idol worshippers, they're going to be like chaff, which is blown away from the threshing floor, and like smoke from a chimney. Now, they didn't have chimneys the way we think of them, with a nice round tube going up, but they would have the ancient equivalent, which would be a window recessed and set up high onto a wall, where the heat would rise and find its place to go out, and so the smoke would depart from that high window. So, working very much like a chimney. Again, we have a reference to past history, chapter 13, verse 4. Yet I have been the Lord your God since the land of Egypt. That was far back in the days of Moses, and you were not known. Excuse me, and you were not to know any God except me. That was at the Mount Sinai, where the Israelites had been told, "You will not have any gods except me, for there is no Savior besides me. I'm your Savior. I am the only God that is." And they had been told that, but now coming into the land, they had entered a pluralistic aspect of their history, where I'm not saying they stopped worshiping God, but they tried to worship God and other pagan gods as well. And that was idolatry. That had been forbidden. Verse 5, I cared for you in the wilderness, in the land of drought. As they had their pasture, they became satisfied. And being satisfied, their heart became proud. Therefore, they have forgotten me. You see, God took care of them, and he gave them gifts. He gave them the land. He gave them crops. He gave them all sorts of good things. And they became so enamored with the good things they received from God, they forgot the giver. They forgot God, who had given to them all of these things. Verse 7, so I will be like a lion to them. Like a leopard, I will lie in wait by the wayside. God, who had been their beneficiary, now will turn into God, their enemy. Verse 8, I will encounter them like a bear robbed of her cubs, and I will tear open their chests. There I will also devour them like a lioness, as a wild beast would tear them. They have aroused the wrath of the Lord. Verse 9, it is your destruction, O Israel, that you are against me, against your help. I've been your helper, and yet you've turned against me. Verse 10, where now is your king, that he may save you in all your cities, and your judges of whom you requested? Give me a king. Remember how back in 1 Samuel, the people had gone to God, and they said, can you give us a king? We want to be like all the other nations. You are our king, but we want a king with skin on. And God had give them a king. That's what he said. They'd asked, give me a king and a prince, and I gave you a king in my anger. You see, God had granted their request. But sometimes when God grants a request, it's not because that's good for you. It can be because it's bad for you. And the request that he grants is actually a sign of his judgment. Notice, I gave you a king in my anger. But not only did he give King Saul and took him away in my wrath, God gave and God took away King Saul. Notice this is still the then. This is going back to what they had done in the past. Verse 12, the iniquity of Ephraim is bound up. His sin is stored up. The pains of childbirth come upon him. He is not a wise son, for it is not the time that he should delay at the opening of the womb. Something's going to be born, and it remains to be seen exactly what that will be. And the pains of childbirth are coming, and what is going to be delivered. Chapter 13, verse 14, shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where is your thorns? O Sheol, and Sheol is just another word for the grave. Actually, it is a word for the grave. Our translators did not translate it. Instead, they just transliterated it. They put the same Hebrew word, and they just put it with English letters. O death, where are your thorns? O Sheol, where is your sting? And of course, you will remember how the Apostle Paul quotes this passage as he's referring to the ultimate redemption from death, not just the redemption from the hands of the Assyrians, but the redemptions of the final enemy, which is death, which will be conquered. O death, where are your thorns? O Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion will be hidden from my sight. And of course, this riddle is unraveled and opened for us when we look at the one who died in our place as a ransom for us, as a ransom from the power of death, so that as we trust in him, we find eternal life, and death loses its thorns, and Sheol loses its sting, and that is the last enemy that will be defeated. So we've seen the message of judgment in the past and the present. That was chapters 11 through 13. But now we come to chapter 14 as we see hope for future restoration. Chapter 14 and verse 1, Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your iniquity. Take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to him, Take away all iniquity, and receive us graciously, that we may present the fruit of our lips. It's a call to come back, to return to God. Verse 3, Assyria will not save us. We will not ride on horses, nor will we say, Our God did the work of our hands. For in you the orphan finds mercy. And remember how Hosea had started with these children that were being born, children of whom it was said, You're not mine. You're cut off. It's as if you're an orphan. And yet, the orphan finds mercy in the hands of the Lord as the people realize that their salvation cannot come from Assyria. It cannot come from cavalry and from horses, or even the work of their own hands, the making of an idol. None of those things work. None of those things accomplish anything, but only the Lord saves. Verse 4, God says, I will heal their apostasy. I will love them freely, for my anger has turned away from them. God's anger, which had come about and which did come about in removing the northern kingdom of Israel from the land and taking them to a far off place. But now there's a promise that the anger will turn aside. Of course, you understand that the anger of God ultimately was met by Jesus on the cross. He took that anger upon himself and was treated as if he was a guilty sinner, so that we can be treated, if we will trust in him, we can be treated as if we were the perfect Son of God. Verse 5, God says, I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like the lily, and he will take root like the cedars of Lebanon. And now notice where we have this growth analogy, this tree and vegetation analogy. Verse 6, his shoots will sprout, and his beauty will be like the olive tree, and his fragrance like the cedars of Lebanon. Cedars of Lebanon, that's the highest tree that anybody from Israel could ever imagine. Verse 7, those who live in his shadow will again raise grain, and they will blossom like the vine. His renown will be like the wine of Lebanon. That is, God is going to plant his people, and they are going to grow into a mighty tree. And that tree will be part of the imagery that we're going to see even when we come to the New Testament, where God's people will be likened to a tree that is sprouting forth, branches grafted in, that takes root and grows greatly in all of its strength and beauty. Verse 8, O Ephraim, what more have I to do with idols? It is I who answer and look after you. I am like a luxuriant cypress. From me comes your fruit. Remember what Jesus said. I am the vine. You are the branches. If you wish to grow, you need to be connected to me. God is saying it here in the Old Testament. Jesus says exactly the same thing of himself in the New Testament. Now we come to the very last verse of the book of Hosea, and it ends in the words that sound like words of wisdom, almost as if we were reading one of the Proverbs. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Remember how we said knowledge is a big thing. In fact, I think that's the key word, the key idea. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. So it's a call to understand. It is a call to know. The reason why that is, for the ways of the Lord are right, and the righteous will walk in them, but transgressors will stumble in them. Now, what this last verse, what this last proverb is doing for us, it's instructing us and telling us that although the book of Hosea was written in the past, it was written to the 10 northern tribes of Israel who were going or had gone into captivity. It's telling us that the message of Hosea um, is still applicable for us today. That is, if you want wisdom, if you want to be discerning, you will understand, you will know the truths that are here, and you will find that it continues to be a way of righteousness. It continues to be a way in which you should walk, and it continues to warn that you might not stumble in the way they stumbled, but that you might learn the lesson of Hosea, the lesson that God saves his people if only you will turn and trust in him.